At 12:17 a.m., the city's map glowed alone on my screen, a quilt of red lanes pulsing like a tired heart. The studio was empty but for the hum and the glass that threw my face back at me, a stranger with sleepless eyes. The phone was not supposed to ring after midnight. When it did, the sound threaded through bone, and a voice I had buried spoke my childhood name and placed a compass in my palm without ever saying the word compass. South Ramp, Old Bridge. The three syllables dragged up a river and a night in Ikenin. Had trained myself not to remember. Wet concrete, a blue hoodie vanishing into headlights, and the man whose hand had steadied the city and unsteadied everything else. The line died. On my desk lay an unmarked envelope, I swear, that had not been there at the start of my shift. Inside, a strip of faded cobalt fabric and a drawn triangle we had once called a promise. I should have called someone. Instead, I took my coat and walked into the rain. The building's night crew moved like ghosts behind tinted glass, a handful of silhouettes patrolling the edges of screens that never slept. I left my badge on its lanyard, a small mute surrender, and felt the empty envelope in my pocket crease against my thigh. The elevator churned down through the building's ribs and let me out to a city pried open by rain. The air tasted of nickel and old leaves. Tire hiss braided with sirens far off, the kind that cleave the night and glue it back together differently. I drove the way a person returns to a childhood street they swore they'd never step on again. Every landmark pulled a thread. The pawn shop with the busted neon O. The mural with the river painted in glossy curls that never managed to look wet until now. The underpass where the ceiling drips in slow, perpetual time. My wipers beat out a metronome the city didn't listen to. South Ramp was a phrase that lived in my mouth like a coin held too long, metallic and stubborn. The closer I got, the more. The map in my head unrolled itself without the help of a glowing screen. Lanes, barriers, the soft shoulder that wasn't soft at all. Old bridges have lungs. They exhale the day's heat and sighs you can feel if you press your palm to their concrete after midnight. This one had cradled parades and protests, grief and grit. The South Ramp twisted down to the river level like a ribbon that had been wrung out too many times. I eased the car into the shadow of a decommissioned way station and killed the lights. The rain turned the world into a million moving, vertical lines. Beyond the barrier, the ramp lay like a tongue bitten hard. There was a time I measured my life in seasons along this river. Summer skate wheels screaming, autumn fog crawling off the water, winter's glassy rim. The triangle had been ours before geometry had names we needed. Three corners, three girls, a shape you could draw with your eyes closed and find each other in any crowd. We carved it into bark when the bark was soft. We sharpened it on notebook margins and bathroom stalls, and once, years ago, we scratched it under the South Ramp in a patch of concrete the city had neglected until we claimed it. That year, one of our corners went missing, and the shape kept wobbling in my head, off-balanced and angry. Journalists like to believe that control is the same as care. We gather facts, we plot them, we draw the neat lines that link them, and at the end, we tell ourselves the truth is an architecture anyone can walk into and feel safe. I learned early that some truths are houses built on swamps. My father had called that pragmatism and told me to watch the river when I wanted to understand the city. He had shown me current maps, floodplains, and the color-coded vulnerability of neighborhoods. He could lift a crisis like a table and slide it too. Safety with a strength people mistook for kindness. It was how he kept us fed and how he kept me quiet. A man cannot be the city's spine and also a crack you trip on. I had learned to hold both those pictures in my head until one of them burned. At the barricade, rain drummed on plastic like impatient fingertips. A makeshift chain-link gate sagged inward where someone had leaned on it too much. The city's warning. Signs fluoresced with a congressional earnestness even the storm couldn't swallow. I slipped through where the fence kissed a battered concrete post. The river below was swollen, its surface stippled with rain, and the trash it ferried along with. No ceremony. Sound pooled under the bridge in strange pockets, amplified and deadened by turns, so that my own footsteps felt like someone else's, arriving a second too late. My phone vibrated as if it too knew the coordinates by muscle memory. The caller ID offered only the exact level of uncertainty. I let it buzz until it gave up and left a hole. No message. Just the new weight of knowing I was not the only one awake and moving toward the same place with a history humming beneath it. The envelope's contents were simple. A strip of cobalt cloth, rough at one edge where threads grids had frayed into hair-thin lines, and a triangle drawn on the back of a parking receipt from a garage near City Hall. June had been cobalt the way some people are in summer. That was how my brain had filed her. Not a girl, but a color that burned the same in photographs and dreams. The night she never came home, that color had become a warning flare. I counted pillars like rosary beads. One carried a bird's nest, made of straw and wire. Another shone with fresh graffiti, a crown atop a name I didn't know. At the sixth pillar, my breath snagged. The concrete was dark with a damp that wasn't only rain. At knee height, near the seam where the ramp met the old retaining wall, there was the faintest etch of a triangle, shallow and new, all three lines still pale against the wet. Someone had knelt there not long ago and pressed a message into stone, with a hand that shook. I should have been the one who left, back when leaving would have made sense. Instead, after the year that emptied June, I stayed and found a job that let me listen to the city breathe. Nights, I read its rhythms the way my father had taught me, except I did it from a chair with coffee gone to tar and a headset that tethered me to the rest of the sleepless. I tracked closures and crashes, water main breaks, and messy weather. The old bridge kept returning like a tick in the corner of an eye. The police called June's case cold. The news called it unsolved. The city called it what the city calls all things it doesn't want to carry. Sad and inevitable. People left candles in chipped jars for a year, and then they left fewer. I built a life around a prick of absence I pretended didn't exist, even as I traced triangles in condensation on my apartment window when the kettle screamed. Under the ramp, the wind changed, carrying a smell that was not river. Sharp, industrial, like hot plastic and warmed copper. Lights from the highway above chopped the darkness into regular panels. In one slice, I saw the wheel of a child's bicycle lodged against a storm grate, one bright reflector blinking in the rain like an exhausted eye. The rational part of my brain assembled innocent narratives and discarded them as quickly. A kid had dumped it early. A storm had shuttled it here. The city's machinery was chewing what the city fed it. The superstitious part, the one June and I used to feed with dares and promises, whispered that objects remember more than we do. I moved deeper, away from the safe lie of the open road. The river made a throat-clearing noise, rough and ongoing. My shoes slurped at slick patches and held on. A swollen drainage pipe exhaled warm air that fogged at the lip and blew my damp hair into strings. The triangle on the concrete felt like a pulse beneath my palm when I crouched to touch it. It wasn't magic, I told myself. It was muscle memory and fear, and whatever current runs between 2 points when one of them starts to hum after years of pretending to be dead. Beyond the sixth pillar, the ramp turned a blind corner. A pale rectangle again. Another envelope, this one waterlogged and fattened, tucked into the seam of a utility box lid with the manic care of someone whose fingertips were numb. I eased it free and watched rain thread along my wrist. Inside lay a key card from my own building and a printout that looked like a stitched-together transcript, timestamps and partial phrases, broken like the river in a high wind. The header held 3 letters in a font I knew too well from late-night problem reports. The city's dispatch system. My father had built his career on making sure those calls moved like blood. In my palm lay a banked heartbeat written in bureaucratic shorthand and breath. It took me 2 passes before my mind accepted the linked facts. These weren't random fragments. They had been pulled, cut, and placed with a surgeon's intent to be found by me beneath the place where our promise once lived. The rain swallowed the edges of the world. I stood with the trash and the pillars and my own pounding in my ears, and for the first time since 12:17 a.m., I felt something like an alignment slide into place. If this was a trap, it was set with the intimacy only a history could provide. If it was a call for help, it had found the one hand that still knew the shape of the answer. I couldn't tell which scared me more. The city held its breath, and I held mine with it, knowing that whatever came next would pry open the past with wet fingers and make me name what I had spent years refusing to look at in the whole light. The transcript in my damp hands was a ruin of toner and rain, but the bones held, timestamps in a column like vertebrae, each line a small vertebrate of fear. A rote number I recognized from late-night calls, a flag that should not have been. Attached to a missing person report, nuisance. Between the lines, an old grief learned a new grammar. Buried in the data was the same phrase repeated at 3 different hours in the same clipped hand. South Ramp, S7. The second time it appeared, someone had altered the priority code and moved it down a rung. The third time, the line ended with a system note about a gate test that any thinking human should have postponed. My father had always said that machines are honest until people are tired enough to teach them how to lie. 7 was not a street address. My muscles remembered what my mind pretended to forget. S7 meant siphon. Line 7. A mouth under the concrete throat of the south ramp, a place you could only reach if you knew where the bridge kept its secrets. We had once snuck in when we were 14, daring each other to press palms to the steel and feel the river's low pulse. June had laughed until she coughed when the first surge kicked, doubling over with a joy that felt like a crime. That night, she decided the world's engines were something she could learn, not something that would always happen to her. The utility box that had cradled the envelope was more than a cabinet. It hid a recessed reader the city used to open maintenance. Spaces. Rain had softened the foam around it into muck, but the green eye still waited. I slid the card along the glass in a motion my body made on autopilot at work. The reader thought for a beat that felt like a dare, and then blinked in agreement. The lock gave the quietest nod. Behind the box, a panel disguised as dead concrete breathed inward and released a stare with teeth worn by boots that had not been children's. The tunnel rolled its own weather out to meet me, warm, damp, metallic. My flashlight made a narrow tunnel inside the tunnel, cutting through the wet with a white that turned fog to skin. The floor sloped and then righted itself, guiding me toward a sound that was not quite water, a deeper hardware purr like the memory of a factory. The walls wore graffiti layered with time, hearts ballooning into carefully lettered dates and names sliced off by fresh paint, ghosts sharing the same skin. In the corner where the stairs bent, someone had scratched a triangle less shy than the one outside, the bottom line thicker, the left corner starred. We had once used that mark to indicate go left and then wait. The muscle memory carried me again. I found the first sign of a presence at elbow height where a pipe elbowed into the corridor, a cobalt thread snagged on a seam, beaded with water, stubborn in the way that cheap dye is inside rain. The smell shifted from metal to a hot sweetness that took a second to place. Melted plastic. A portable battery exhaled near a wall, its indicator a breathing insect. Above it, a web of wires stitched a makeshift antenna to a grate that gave on to nothing but dark. Someone had built a cell repeater out of patience and scavenged parts. Someone had decided that calls would get through where before they had hit a dead spot and drowned. The earlier ring at my desk echoed in my bones with a different timbre. It was not a ghost, but a loop, a piece of recorded breath pulled from an archive and thrown across the night. I moved deeper because turning back would have been another kind of drowning. The corridor opened into a chamber that pretended to be a room and failed. It was a tall cylinder in which water had learned to fall gracefully, embracing silence until something forced it to roar. A catwalk ran a horseshoe around the edges, slick with condensation. On each quarter turn, a control box studded the rail. Old buttons in institutional green and red, metal tags pressed with numbers and a lingo. Only the river workers and their bosses pretended to enjoy. S7 was cut into the nearest plate with care that read as reverence or fear. The panel's small screen blinked an error code I remembered from those binder-thick manuals people refused to throw away. The words came back like a language you think. You can no longer understand until your mouth starts forming sounds before your brain can name them. Auto, sequence pending. Test, cycle scheduled. I checked the time more out of habit than necessity. The river above me had lived on its own timing. The city had taught it to keep appointments. My watch agreed with the panel in the sour way two clocks agree when one of them is wrong on purpose. 2 minutes. The surge would do what it always did. Purge debris, clear the channel. It would not care if I were weight and meat and memory. In the way of its job, I looked for the override and found the slot that should have accepted my card. The reader was taped, peeling. Someone had tried to keep it alive with adhesive and will. I slid the card. The same green eye behind a different face took me in and looked away. Authorization denied. Different clearance. In the corner of my vision, another triangle. This one chalked near a knee-high service hatch. The left corner bolded. The bottom line extended. A code we had invented when we were still making games out of danger. Get low. Go left longer than you think you should. Wait. I lay my body flat and pulled, feeling the hatch resist and then give with a hush that might have been gratitude. The space beyond knew how to be forgotten. My palms found a crawl ledge, and my knees read the texture of a surface that had been polished by fear. I dragged myself worm-like toward a spill of faint amber light and came up under the catwalk, at its blind corner. There, under the platform's lip, a slim ledge hugged the chamber like a seam. If the surge hit, the ledge might be high enough to keep a body breathing, or it might not. The machinery coughed once like a throat nursing a wrong. Swallow. A valve somewhere clanked in a way that bypassed language and went straight to the part of me that remembered standing on river rocks while someone upstream opened a dam. The roar arrived a second later and ate conversation my mind was having with itself. The first push lifted the hair on my arms. The second reached for my ankles and found purchase. The third was a hand with a plan. The river's voice is not a metaphor when it is under your ribs. I pressed my back to the concrete that was colder than bone. The surge clawed for the space under the catwalk and then spent itself and hissed like an exhausted crowd. Trash registered as moving life in the corner of my eye, an apple skin, a plastic bag, a newspaper headline I refused to read. In the retreating wet, the amber light strengthened. The source lay behind a sheet of plexiglass duct taped to a hole in the wall, a DIY window into a mothball room. I slid toward it and peered through. Inside, an empty chair faced a table that had been auditioning for the role of desk. Its surface wore a municipal topography. Maps folded and refolded until their creases were on the verge of tearing. Binders with spine labels reduced to chalk, a coffee cup with a ring that had outlived its liquid, and a cluster of objects under a weight of rubber band insistence. I found the seam of a door, groped for a latch, and bullied my way into the room with a hip and a prayer I refused to articulate. The air was warmer, threaded with dust and the kind of stillness that means someone was here 5 minutes ago, or 5 years ago. And you cannot tell which because the story is the same. On the back wall, someone had pinned a photocopy of the river map my father had loved as if it were a portrait. Colored dots marked outlets and intakes, each dot numbered. S7 wore a ring of 3 tiny triangles drawn in a hand I knew like my own. In the mirror of the plexiglass, my face looked like a version of me who had aged in a direction I did not consent to, cheekbones felled by rain, eyes that had memorized a thing before allowing themselves to be afraid of it. The cluster of objects, under the rubber bands unspooled with the patience of an apology. A flash drive blacker than its case, a transit pass with an expiry of a month out. A key, not for doors, but for a locker, stamped with a tiny crown that matched the graffiti on the 6th pillar. A folded photograph, its edges cracked from too much pocketing. The picture held us 3, knee to knee on a curb painted to look like water, a performative mural we had mocked until we used it as our bench. June leaned into the camera with that same irrepressible cobalt and a grin edged toward a secret. The third point of our triangle, Lena, hated photographs. She had been caught mid-gesture, a blur that ran like a watermark under our smiles. Someone had drawn a triangle over our knees and shaded one corner. Lena, not here. June and I. An equation not solved. The flash drive slotted into the back of the console in the corner as if it had been born there. The old screen buzzed awake and took a second to decide to keep going. The file hierarchy was a forest, and my hand wanted to shake until I thought of it as a path lined with stones. The folder names had the Philistine brevity of government, Effelgate, override, Arch, B record. I found June where I did not want to. Under Arch, which reduced the frailty of voices to letters. The clip was not long. The transcript translated her breath into brackets and labeled it with institutional shame. The content was supposed to be anonymized, but the waveforms had more personality than the form would allow, and the face above the playback bar did not need a name to be June. She had called from a place she did not understand, except in how it was shaped and how it moved. Her words were not allowed to be precise. Fear takes nouns and verbs and mangles them into gesture. She said south and ramp in a pattern and a tone that made the hair on my neck line up like soldiers. She said 7 twice, as if she were chasing the number back toward me. A dispatcher marked her as possibly intoxicated because fear distorts sound. The log noted that gate tests were in progress under a supervisor's schedule. The supervisor's initials were 2 letters I'd written 1,000 times on school forms and gifts and last-minute notes stuck on the fridge. I couldn't unknow the shape they made. Memory is a clever tailor. It can fit you for a life that never belonged to you simply by cinching certain scenes and letting others out. When June went missing, the city had put operative words on the news feed and kept a careful eye. She was 19, she had dropped out, she had trouble at home, she had a face that cameras loved. People nodded the way people nod at the weather. The detective had spread his empathy too thinly across too many cases and gave us a level of care one step above polite. Neighbors left her name in candles until the wind ate the wicks. A rumor moved through our neighborhood like mildew, calling June a problem and not a person, a runaway not worth the gas. The people who made those sounds did not wear uniforms, and some of them did. When I brought a manila folder of printouts to my father and told him that someone had rewrote the sequence, that night he placed the folder on his desk with a gentleness that conveyed mercy and told me he would handle it. He had other words, I remember, not at the surface but in the muscle, like the way a river runs in almost the same channel even when it has changed banks. In the underbridge room, someone had taped a map of contractor zones over the city's own map, and the overlap looked like insufficient transparency. A company name threaded through the margins in a dozen stamped forms. Argent Municipal, the river cleanup outfit that had bought half the old machinery at auction and sold it back to the city at a markup with a new logo. I remembered glossy press photos of men in new hard hats smiling with their eyes, the way people do when they are told to smile by someone other than a photographer. The signatures in the corner belonged to my father, the mayor, and a man from Argent whose card I had found once in our kitchen junk drawer. The red dot on the server screen pulsed. The repeater in the hall had found another piece of breath to throw like a paper airplane into my night. The phone in my pocket hummed with a number that refused to name itself. I listened, but not with my ears. I let the sound find the same channel June's number had found, under skin in bone. South Ramp was again a set of syllables that held 30 days of weather between them. The voice fumbled a word I didn't catch and then said vault in a shape that sent my eyes to the console's diagram. The vault lived below the chamber I was in, a slab space where gates kissed and seals tried their best. I left the flash drive in the console as if removing it would unglue my head. The alley staircase behind the underbridge room gave way to a narrower throat of concrete, a place with a generous opinion of itself because it offered a ladder and a series of D-rings hammered into the wall. My hands found rust and then metal under the rust. The ladder swayed where it should not and steadied where it had no right. The vault door was what it had always been, overbuilt and underloved. A small reader sat squat beside it like a toad. I touched my card to it and felt silly until it burped a welcome I had not earned, and the door gave its own version of a sigh. Inside was sound caught and held in a square. The vault gathered every noise and fed it back to you pre-chewed. The floor had an inch of water that could not decide if it was leaving or staying, and my steps made small talk with it. Along one wall, the kind of locker you could put secrets in, lined up like soldiers who had forgotten what war they were fighting. A locker wore a crown stamp near its lock whose fatigue said it had been opened more times than its finish could withstand. The key from the desk fitted with a click whose satisfaction I wished did not thrill me. Inside, the present and the past had made a family out of what was on hand. A coil of cobalt ribbon that had long ago surrendered its original tasks and become a talisman. A zippered pouch filled with wax pencils in highway colors. A laminator with its gut removed. A handful of badges with lanyards like nooses, tagged with departments and subcontractors, and one with my own building's logo partially scratched away. A small notebook whose paper had resisted humidity better than my thoughts, pages filled, with neat block letters that refused to call themselves neat. The notes held not poetry or despair, but math, times of day, valve numbers, phone call durations next to names that had been anonymized in the system, but not here. One entry war, today's date in a tilt that made my chest hurt. The math offered itself to me as a ladder across a second truth. The calls had not ended in June. The system had misheard other girls, other boys, other people who called from low spaces where a wrong surge could take them and call it inevitable. The sequence had not been random. Specific test cycles were run during unavoidable storms, and the storms were not left to chance when budgets, calendars, and press conferences wanted them. Footsteps above me leaned into the vault's air and became someone I could almost name. The gate was careful and quick, the way you move when you have broken your idea of yourself and are carrying the pieces. A figure flicked into the slice of light under the vault door and moved on. A minute later, my phone betrayed my presence with light. A new message came without text, a blank bubble that carried the echo of the call in its silence like a cup that remembered water. The empty screen reflected my face and a smear of movement behind me. I turned on a reflex that belonged to a younger animal and found the person I had been chasing with my memory and my feet. The blue hoodie was plural. It was the idea of June in color and cotton. It was the person who wore it and had been leaving me breadcrumbs with a handwriting like my own. She was thinner than the weight the hoodie suggested. The fabric ballooned with rain and effort. Her face was fierce, not in the way of someone angry, but in the way of someone held together by intent. She looked older than our last summer and younger than the grief I had given her. The list of words I wanted to put into the air was longer than the vault and not allowed in this version of our story. She raised a hand, palm out, the triangle inked at its center like a new heart, and then she put that hand to the console in a gesture that made the vault consider her as a user. The console woke again to its own logic, washing the ceiling with lines of light that pretended to be neutral. The hooded figure moved with a familiarity that made me ashamed of how I had let the city rust in my hands. The sequence diagram shifted under her touch. Manual override toggled to local. A list of scheduled cycles scrolled with an indifference that had once comforted me. The cursor hovered over a line that wore my father's initials. The screen offered no context, yet it provided all of it. Above us, somewhere between the bridge belly and the rain, an engine revved the way political engines do when they have decided to make a problem into a narrative. The vault door leaned inward. Air changed shape around it. We froze, not from fear, but from a calculation that involved bodies and openings and choices. I thought of the envelope on my desk like a lost tooth. I thought of the bicycle wheel's tired eye. I thought of the triangle June had drawn on the back of a parking receipt as if geometry could still be a promise. The door completed its sigh and stopped at a setting that meant invitation or ambush. The edge of a crimson coat cut into the rectangle of the doorway like a final edit. The rain came in behind it in a curtain that wanted to be a wall. The person in the red moved with the authority of someone who had worn keys too long to remember what it was like to walk without them. The crimson fabric was wrong under the bridge and right on someone who had spent years making the weather bend to her. She stepped into the vault's half-light, and the situation changed its rules without telling us. The hooded figure's shoulders tightened into a brace. My body chose a position and then negotiated with fear about whether it could keep it. Behind the red, another shape waited without making itself into a person. A third presence sucked oxygen and replaced it with patience. The vault did its job of holding noise and feeding it back to us untrustworthy. The screen showed 3 active users when it had never wanted more than one. The cursor vibrated over a button that wore language we had never disobeyed. The river put its knuckles against the door and considered knocking. I understood then that this was not a closed loop. I had been given to run alone. A hand had led mine to every rung and expected me to climb. A different hand had coached the machinery to forget cries in specific timbres. Between those hands lay a city that wanted to keep living without knowing what it had eaten. The person in the blue had made a home in the machinery to root the small breaths the system did not want to hear. The person in red had come to make sure that the house burned neatly. In the surface of the console's glass, I saw the ghost of another face that was mine and not mine, older and more composed, the kind of face that asks forgiveness with a plan attached. Above the vault, the old bridge exhaled and waited. The following minutes would rearrange the version of the city I had built my body around, or they would pour concrete over it and declare the shape inevitable. The triangles we had carved into younger nights watched from damp walls like options. The red cloth carried a memory my body recognized before my mind named it. The brisk pivot she had when a plan was 2 heartbeats from landing. The chin tipped, a degree toward defiance. The silver band on her right hand that had survived fads and losses. She was not a stranger in a uniform. She was the third angle of our old shape, wearing authority like armor. Lena had traded our triangles for keys and a title that could unlock any door under this city. The sight of her in the vault rewrote my grief in a syntax I hated and understood. Behind her, the other presence resolved into the outline of a man who at once seemed permanent. My father entered like weather that refused to declare itself. His hair lay in straight, wet lines. His jaw was set in that managerial patience that had always intimidated manipulated fate into compliance. Between the three of us, the room recalibrated and then lied about it. The console did not care for reunions. It bloomed a countdown in red, a window floating above its more innocent diagrams. Test cycle engagement in progress. Remote confirmation required. 2 pairings of initials flashed like a signature trying to undo itself. One belonged to the man whose pen had signed the systems that kept the city's lungs moving. The other overlay wore the trim arrogance of corporate, Argent's stamp, shorter than legality, longer than shame. Under these, in smaller type, an italicized revision history tilted toward pettiness, a downgrading, annotated months back. The user string was an alias I had typed so often my fingers still remembered the vowel-consonant rhythm. The final shock landed not as thunder, but as cold rain. The original dismissal of June's call had been executed on my credentials, in my voice borrowed by a tired version of me who had wanted the night to behave. The system had been honest until I helped teach it how to lie. June's face under the hoodie was the kind that refuses to be a ghost. She had the narrowness that happens when you live on edges and adrenaline, eyes held in a too bright focus born between sleep deprivation and purpose. She moved like a person who had mapped this space in the dark 1,000 times. Her hand lowered to the console with a sureness that came from practice, and the bank of status lights inhaled as if bracing for argument. Manual override toggled with a reluctance that read as dignity. Local control lit, wavered, and held. The countdown kept hunting for its authority as if it could sniff it out through concrete. Above us, the bridge spoke in metal, groans and ticks, that old language of load and weather. My father absorbed the room and did what he had always done, located the lever that would remove variables. His gaze flicked from my phone to the repeater, wires we had puzzled into the wall in the next corridor to the emergency stop embedded in the catwalk's spine. The calculus was clean in his body. It had been trained over half a lifetime to understand thresholds and sacrifice. He did not fake gentleness with his hands. He reached not for me, but for the sequence, fingers hovering over a confirmation he had taught generations of dispatchers to revere. Lena stood between his plan and June's counterplan, her posture asserting the habits of a person paid to keep water from becoming story. If there was a script, she had rewritten it already. The river made its first move. The gate shivered like an animal reluctant to wake, and I felt the low swell in the vault floor before the eye saw it. Water rose against my shins with a pressure that was more argument than threat. The console blinked 2 disagreeing truths at once. Manual override engaged, remote sequence pending. The archivist in me wanted to reconcile them. The animal Tenchitakshu in me wished to breathe. The woman in me, who had once pressed a triangle into damp concrete beside 2 girls she loved, wanted to draw a line, so bright it would burn a hole in this night and let morning through. June looked at me without asking anything and somehow requested everything. The call had never been only hers, it had always been ours, pieced from 1,000 smaller calls that had been treated like noise. The repeater in the corridor ticked in my skull with its insect LED, the way tenacity does. I understood the path laid in front of my hands the way a climber understands the next hold. I slid my phone out, thumbed to open the gate I had left, propped in the system upstairs when the old console breathed to life. The flash drive's contents were already mirrored. The city's hunger for redundancy was finally working in my favor. I opened the distributor we all pretended we never built for ourselves, and selected every newsroom I had ever hated for getting a minor detail wrong, and every citizen tip line that had ever sent me a photograph at 3 a.m. of something that should not have existed. The progress bar unfolded like breath measured, 10%, 30, 50. Somewhere above, a relay complained. Water climbed my calves and negotiated my knees. Lena moved toward the emergency stop. Her coat made a red atmosphere, a weather system of its own. She knew, as I did, that a complete halt here would flood upstream neighborhoods that had spent a decade pretending they were safe. Her training made her calculations merciless. She would take 2 names over 2,000. The problem was that the 2 names were mine. June slid along the catwalk to the manual wheel. the old iron that nobody believes still matters until the circuits give them the wrong answer. She braced and put weight into it in a rhythm I understood. It was the same beat we had used to time, our secrets when we were little. The wheel resisted like a memory. Then it yielded one notch, then two. My father stepped into the space between their efforts and me, as if, by force of habit, he had always been a better door than any door. His eyes found mine without apology, but with a weight that surprised me. He had not known June was alive. That realization moved through his shoulders like a reversal of gravity. His thumb hovered over the confirmation that would prioritize upstream protection, budgets, optics, and the illusion that the system was kind. In another life, that thumb had traced the lines on a paper map spread across our kitchen table, patient as a man showing a child where she could build a kite and where she could not. Now it trembled in the air it had always thought it owned. The countdown stuttered. The console announced in its bloodless way that a local lockout had been asserted. Lena's mouth twitched into the ghost of disbelief and then hardened into industry. If she could not stop the system politely, she would break the part that was fighting back. She went for the network trunk mounted too neatly along the vault wall, hands fast with years of authorized sabotage. She didn't tear, she unplugged, precise enough to unsettle me, confident in her muscle memory. For a breath, my progress bar froze at 84, and I thought about retreating. My fingers found the coffin-black housing of the repeater's auxiliary, the one June had bolted to the metal like a contraband prayer. I jammed my phone into the cradle with a force the manufacturer did not recommend. The device birthed heat and light. The bar crawled again. The river took another step, less polite this time, arms around my thighs, testing balance. June's shoulders shook with effort. I wasn't allowed to call Herculean. The wheel answered her with a croak that passed for acquiescence. The gate above us hesitated as if listening, and then shifted. The change was small enough to look like a mistake on a graph, and big enough to make the vault's pressure reconfigure. Water sucked backward in a kind of asthmatic draw. For a second, there was room for breath again. My father made his choice in the old way, not with words, but with a sequence of movements that a child knows better than a psychologist. He stepped away from the confirmation. He put his hand not on the console but on the catwalk rail between Lena and the network, a line drawn physically because lines drawn on paper had failed. He had not come to throw us in. He had come believing he could shepherd the machinery back into the narrative he was married to. Realizing the narrative was a lie had unmanned him. The decision unclenched his jaw and put 20 years on his face in 1 second. He did not become a hero. He became a man who had to stand in front of a younger version of himself and not flinch. Lena looked at me with a steadiness that came from a different hurt. She had swum away years ago into a world where outcomes were features, not bugs, where you could pre-schedule wreckage and call it preparedness. She had always hated photographs because they flattened motion. Now she was a photograph I would never unsee. Her keys clinked against the console as she reached for one more buried override. Corporate always keeps an extra Adam's rib tucked away in the software. The screen offered it to her for a heartbeat and then retracted it. June's local lockout held the door with a tenacity that did not care about badges. 97%, 98. The vault filled its lungs and waited for me to commit to having set something in motion that would not be forgiven. My phone vibrated like a small animal and then exhaled. Files replicated. Notifications went out. Somewhere above, a newsroom intern would sit up straight and call a producer. Somewhere else, a mother would read the word nuisance next to a timestamp, the same hour her child had called for help, and mark a new anniversary. The city's map at 12:17 a.m. finally revealed its current state. The surge, thwarted, did not vanish. It searched for a home and found our ledge again. It slammed once into the underside of the catwalk, making the iron sing in a register that felt like panic. My father's shoe slipped on a skin of algae, and he lunged in a reflex that would have taken him into water and iron and the kind of headlines that bury nuance. June's hand shot out and found the sleeve of his coat without ceremony. The cobalt ribbon on her wrist flashed absurdly bright as she used it to anchor her grip around his arm, a color swatch tying timeline to timeline. He found purchase on the rail, and the floor returned under him. The three of us froze in a shape that did not have a name. The triangle had its corners again for a heartbeat, and not one of them was where it had started. The console stopped arguing with itself. The remote control fell into a flat line. Manual held. The countdown expired with a whimper, not a bang, and then withdrew from the screen as if embarrassed by its own certainty. The vault's water listlessly pawed at my knees and then resisted. Gravity in its slow descent. Lena stared at the blank where her command had been and absorbed what it meant to lose an abstract to a human body. Her shoulders squared in that way I remembered from 100 childhood standoffs when she would not admit to a loss until she had calculated what it could buy. She turned on her heel, read, a little less sure in the vault's light, and headed for the door with a gait that promised this was not over. Corporate never concedes on the first draft. My father didn't follow her. He stayed and looked at the wheel as if it had become a moral instrument. Somewhere above ground, sirens were learning. A new route. Lights threw themselves under the bridge like confetti they had not earned. The vault door yawned wider, curious instead of predatory now. The repeater's tiny LED pulsed like a living thing proud of its own stubbornness. June leaned into the wall with the unsteady relief of someone whose body is reconsidering being alive in public. In me, the past finished unlocking a door it had kept shut, and the room beyond was not a chamber of monsters, but a ledger. On one side, a series of compromises that had built a city that won awards. On the other hand, names that did not graduate to data. I had held the pen for one line. The ink had finally dried. The vault exhaled the way old buildings do after an alarm, each concrete cell letting go of a held note. Water slunk back into channels meant for it, sulking, obedient only because there was nothing left to argue with. The small machine we had bolted into defiance continued to hum its insect-like light. My legs found steadiness in increments. Above us, sirens braided into a new pattern, no longer theater, but intent. Boots met the catwalk and made the iron confess where it was thin. Hands in reflective gloves lifted, pointed, gestured the choreography of professionals who hated surprises. The world that runs on procedure finally found us. No one wrote the story of that hour cleanly. Rooms like this refuse neat paragraphs. The flash drive stuttered out a final breath into the cloud and went still. The console, stripped of duplicity, wore a neutrality that felt like shame. My father palmed his keys as if they were hot. The act of clipping them to the rail was small enough to look like fidgeting and large enough to reorder a life. He did not announce surrender by posture or word. He made space where he had been a door. Lena carried her red weather into the corridor and away, past men who respected credentials and not history. Her coat became an after-image under the bridge's ribs. The air recalibrated without her. We climbed not in triumph, but in stages, like people leaving a church after bad news. Rain had softened to a fine grit that laced the air with a metallic sweetness. Headlights turned the undersides of leaves into coins. The child's bicycle by the storm grate had collected a ruff of river. Grass, a new neck for an old toy. A pair of city workers lifted it out with a tenderness they would later deny and leaned it against a pillar as if it belonged to someone who was on their way back. Under the ramp, the triangles we had carved across the years wore a gloss of water and reflected the world upside down. News finds water lines faster than water does. By morning, the city had grown another layer of commentary. The clips went out in their jagged pieces, not the vault itself, but the parts that words could carry. Error codes and schedules, stamps and signatures, the ruinous word that had nested in the system like a fungus until it taught younger workers to normalize its weight. A river of old calls fed into new ears. People recognized dates and hours and called their own names back into the record. Faces I had never seen stood in grocery aisles and hallways and parking lots and recognized a tone they had once been told was unimportant. They began to make a ledger, line by line, on paper and in the air. The city responded the way institutions do when the ground shifts. It issued statements, formed committees, and made lists. The nuisance flag died in a single memo that pretended to be born of consensus, and not shame. Training documents shed language like a mold. Gate tests were moved to daylight where cameras could eliminate laziness. An independent audit took shape like a scaffold around a soft story. The council held a hearing in a room designed to make people feel heard. word. My father sat at a table that had never learned how to tell the truth without props, and offered the kind of admission that was action, not performance, not forgiveness, but air. He retired with a title that sounded like a thank you and a not quite apology carved between the lines. The map he loved remained on the wall. The legend at the bottom changed. Argent pivoted the way corporations do when the weather turns. It defended the process and blamed subcontractors and pointed to the city's own habits with a legal finger that had never been wet. It lost a contract by degrees and learned how under bridges become front-page photographs. Lena did not appear in any of the official pictures. Her name rose and fell in documents like a tide line. Weeks later, in a hearing many people did not watch, she took a seat no one expected her to take and confirmed what the paper already knew, not because a camera wanted her to, but because she had been built for outcomes and could read the new map. She left with less authority jangling at her hip and more weight in the way she moved through the city, a redistribution of assets that never shows up in budgets. June did not let cameras appoint an ending to her. She kept the hood when she needed to and shed it when her skin wanted air. She stayed with the river and taught it new tricks. She threaded repeaters along dead corridors with the quiet complicity of maintenance workers who know that compassion often requires minor crimes. She found others who had lived under the city's machinery. She brought them into rooms where their stories were no longer folded into footnotes. Together, they installed little boxes along the floodline that listened. First, and labeled later, black devices humming like beetles under the lip of the world. A network grew where rumor had once lived, and the late-night map on my screen began to look like a heartbeat more than a hazard. I kept my chair for a while. The city still needed someone to watch it breathe, sneeze, and cough at 2 in the morning. My headset sat differently on my head after the vault. It felt less like a leash and more like a stethoscope. Calls that would once have slid into the system's gullet now caught on my ear and held. A new column in the nightly report tracked near misses and misheard words. I sent messages to engineers who had never met me and learned their first names, the way you know your own, after you've said it out loud too often. When the old bridge was scheduled for the kind of maintenance that requires orange cones and patience, I wrote the note that asked the crew chief to leave a square of concrete, unpolished, under the south ramp. He did not ask why. We etched the triangle there again with a key that no longer opened the vault. Consequences unfolded in concentric circles, some visible, some stubbornly private. My father found a quieter apartment on a hill he had once recommended for its fault lines. He walked the river in a rain jacket that made him anonymous and stopped, touching maps long enough to let them touch him back. We learned how to be two people who owed each other honesty more than defense. Lena began showing up in places where people argued about permits, air quality, and floodplains without performing. She sat at the edge of those circles with her red coat folded on her lap like a retired flag. She no longer needed to be the weather. She had decided to learn how to stand in it. June and I met at the river in hours that did not insult either of our nervous systems. We did not restore a past. We engineered a present. On a morning when fog lifted in paragraphs and the city had a fever of sirens nowhere near us, we tied a strip of cobalt ribbon to the rail under the south ramp, a small defiance against abrasion and time. The ribbon made no promise it could not keep. It simply made a statement about continuity. In the grimy light, it looked almost electric. The ledger grew in my notebooks. It held not just the names the city had misheard, but the quiet miracles. That would have gone uncounted. A wheel turned by a body that refused to stop. A switch that held because a hand had learned it in the dark. A bureaucratic string of letters rearranged into a sentence that prevented a cycle that would have drowned a name. I taught myself a new practice the way you learn to braid. Taking 3 strands, fact, feeling, consequence, and rotating them into a line that held. When I finally slept, the map on the backs of my eyelids glowed differently. It no longer pulsed like a tired heart. It learned how to beat with purpose. The bridge kept breathing. The city continued to pretend it could be understood. Every night at 12:17 a.m., the clock in my head marked a private vigil and then opened like a door onto a room where fear was not edited out. The phone still rang, and sometimes it still sounded like a ghost breathing through metal, but habit had been broken. The labels had been scraped down. The first instinct inside the building and under the bridge became to listen. The old triangle we had drawn, the one we had learned to live without, became many triangles. They appeared in meeting notes as bullets, in chalk on sidewalks after rallies, in the quiet geometry of three people standing together in a space where only one had been expected to show up. The shape stabilized not by returning to childhood, but by letting reality mature it into an adult. The city continued to build its houses on questionable ground. It always will. The question shifted from whether the ground is pure to whether the foundation includes the voices that live closest to the flood. The last time I pressed my palm to the bridge, the concrete held the day's warmth the way it had promised in my memory. My reflection in the river was a loose sketch, a person made of lines that could be redrawn. The cobalt ribbon flicked in a light breeze and diminished nothing. Somewhere across town, a new operator muttered the new script and meant it. Somewhere else, a mother moved a candle from her windowsill into a box because the anniversary was no longer the only way to count time. Under the city, the little black boxes hummed toward each other like insects in tall grass. Above it, a plane traced a white line to a place where none of this mattered, and all of it did. What do we owe the voices the system taught us to ignore? And when your phone rings at 12:17 a.m., which map do you trust? The one on your screen or the one drawn under your skin?